So one of the things is, and just confirm, Eric, that you see a quote up on the screen here.
Yeah, it's
okay.
Coming in clear. Looks great. Thanks.
Looks like we're looking good here. So, you know, as we think about how the industry is rapidly changing, I think this quote from Warren Buffett about leaky boats is prescient. I think as we look at what's going on in the industry, I think one of the key things that we're seeing is certain providers are and content owners and companies are really focused on preserving or holding on to what they've got as long as they can, and OTT is a ancillary strategy, and others are effectively burning the boats and forging ahead with new business models. And you're seeing, I think, a variety of different strategies on either side of that axis. Clearly, you know, as someone who's been focused purely on OTT, you know, I'm a big advocate for, you know, creative destruction so that you can achieve. But the reality is it's difficult to do. You know, it's the classic innovator's dilemma. And I think, you know, nowhere is that more apparent than in the steep decline of linear TV viewership. Actually, you know, as when I started pulling this together, Dish hadn't released their numbers yet. But as you look here, you know, I think we're seeing the same trend that we've seen all along, but at this point, it's become really kind of an unavoidable acceleration, and it's a very difficult trend to ignore at this point. I think, you know, in aggregate, we're looking at somewhere between 6 to 8% year-over-year decline in total cable subs. And when you start to dig into the numbers even more closely, what you start to see, you know, if you focus on that brown line there, that's total video customers, total households. You know, I think that number peaked in the mid 90 millions about 5 years ago. And you know, as you can see, we're on a pretty precipitous slope downward. I think that you know, that factor is not only going to continue, but is going to keep accelerating. As you look at some of the factors that are driving this, clearly, you know, I think as you look at consumer surveys that are out there, one of the single biggest motivating factors is price. Cord cutting is a predominantly economic decision when asking of consumers. So, you know, it's easy to forget just how expensive cable is when the median household income in the U.S. Is, you know, in the mid $60,000s of dollars. That extra $100 a month that they're spending on cable, or $75 a month, or $80 a month, is a lot of money, and even more so now in this environment. By the way, as you guys have questions, you know, pop them into the Q&A section, and we're happy to address these at the end here. I'm going to try to blaze through this pretty quickly. As you start to looking at all of these households without cable, this is a slightly older data point. I don't have a new one updated for 2019, but you know, clearly that number is dramatically accelerating. This here, this information here really sort of illustrates it, I think, you know, in very poignant terms. If you take into account virtual MVPDs, the decline shows it's, you know, slightly under 4%. With MVPD declines, we're hitting about 7%. So what, you know, what that's really telling is the bulwark that virtual MVPDs were supposed to become have effectively not really stemmed the tide. In fact, you know, I think as these channels continue to bulk up, continue to bulk up with adding new channels and new bundles, what we're ending up seeing is consumers really are not liking the direction the pricing is going there. I think another factor that we're also seeing on that front is, oops, sorry, there it went back. Another factor we're seeing on that front is the ease of exiting one of these packages is far easier. You know, it's the blessing and curse of the virtual MVPD to be able to cancel it, you know, within the same month without any contracts. So another thing we're starting to take a look at, some pretty permanent shifts in viewing behavior. Here's a chart that it's from Nielsen. This is actually from Matt Ball, former strategist at Churnin and Amazon. Great follow if you get a chance. This work is his doing. And by the way, everybody knows me as a curator. None of this research is mine. I'm the curator of it today, assembling it for your viewing pleasure. And everyone's credited here, and I can happily provide you sources to full documents on all of this stuff if you want them. But really, if you look at here, if you look at viewing time, spent time watching pay TV, we're looking at some pretty precipitous declines, especially as you start to look at the lower age brackets down at the bottom of the chart here. On top of that, you know, look at the change in hours spent monthly watching television on the right side. This is a huge shift and really reflects, you know, the secular decline of the consumption of linear television, which is being replaced by both OTT and many other factors. It's not just OTT driving this behavioral change. This is also based off of long-standing systematic shifts in how we consume mobile devices and other things. Another key factor, this is another you know, great data source from Nielsen here, audience composition has really started to shift. As you see, live TV is becoming a very old medium. It's a habitual subscription. It's expensive. That tends to be, you know, the viewers that are going to be most likely to maintain there. What's interesting, though, and I'll get to this as another piece of the trend coming up, is while you saw the biggest shifts in consumption and declines in consumption of people, you know, call it 30 years and younger, on the flip side, while median the live age for the traditional consumption is still high, that is also the prime audience for the shift from linear to OTT. So we'll talk about that here shortly. This is basically the trend of OTT going mainstream beyond the early adopters. If you all are kind of familiar with the adoption cycle, you know, it's usually very tech-centric, early adopters that sort of help pave the path when things are really hard to do. If you think about the early days of cord cutting and, you know, having to use Plex and other boxes that you had, Boxy that you'd hook to the TV, you needed to build a PC to do it. Today, all you need to get involved in OTT, all you really need to do is buy a smart TV and plug it in. So what that means is for the late adopters and the mainstream audiences, it's as easy as just buying a new television or plugging in a box that has a dead simple interface. You know, so the younger cohorts are still over-indexing, but as you see here, you know, these numbers are trending, have been trending in the other direction, especially as you start to get up in the older cohorts. Anecdotally, it really is a content-dependent push as well. Some of the channels that I distribute or operate have, you know, a median age of late 50s. So I think that's a trend you're going to continue to see as this gets easier. Another big trend I think that we've seen, and we talk a lot about AVOD. You know, as the AVOD market really starts to mature here domestically, it's easy to forget about the international AVOD market. And you know, traditionally that market has been quite challenged, predominantly due to three factors. One being the lack of high-speed internet at affordable prices, and two, the high cost of CDN in turn for people delivering content, and then three, the relatively low CPMs relative to Europe and the US. A lot of those factors are really changing pretty dramatically here. So if you look here at the US AVOD market, you know, this last year we're somewhere around $8.25 billion or so. So you see, you know, next year we're looking at that being up to about 11 billion. So interestingly, if you look at APAC, that market is pretty much caught up with us. That's driven heavily by China and you know, the rise of big streamers over there like Ichi and Tencent that do have heavy ad components. But it's also being driven by Singapore. It's being driven by Vietnam and other territories where the cost of delivering to end consumers has gotten much cheaper. I could speak, for example, from my own experience. I did a global CDN deal at an incredibly low price for worldwide. I'm not paying by territory anymore. And I think that's, you know, now granted, the CPMs have to catch up. I think that's been you know, that was a problem for, you know, countries that tried to push globally early. You know, an example has been LATAM. There's been a lot of services that have tried to launch and deploy down there, and the CPMs just couldn't support the business. I think we're starting to really, though, see a shift in those CPMs, and you know, obviously driven by Asia. Europe is a little hampered by the sort of balkanization and the ability to get scale multi-territory there. There's still a lot of rights restrictions and other things that prevent really scaling eyeballs up territory-wide. But even then, that market is still catching up, and I think that's going to be a big growth area over the next 12 to 18 months, as evidenced by Pluto, Tubi, and other launches that are kind of pushing into there. But obviously, you see the pie more than doubling over the last 24 months. By the way, as we say AVOD here, I know everyone talks about free ad-supported streaming television. For the purposes of this conversation, consider them in the same bucket. Last bucket here is India. As you look at that, I think you know, one key factor on this is you know, India traditionally had not been a big smart TV platform. That has changed. They're now shipping about 15 million, or about half the US footprint, a little under half the US footprint every year, and that's growing pretty rapidly. Those high CPMs, high engagement, high watch times are going to make India a real hot market for connected TV growth and in turn AVOD growth. And it's really become the next big battleground. Lastly, smart TV, or sorry, I have one more after this one. I'm going to move through this pretty quick since I think we've got a pretty tight schedule today. But smart TV, as everybody knows, has made huge strides over the last 5 years. I think one of the big factors in that has been you know, the advent of really high quality chipsets that enable you know, if you played with one of these smart TVs in 2011 or 2012, the TVs were just too underpowered and the operating systems were subpar to really provide a good quality experience. And so because of that, a lot of people weren't bothering to adopt apps. People weren't using the apps. Roku really changed the game there, basically piggybacking on the back of subsidized Chinese TVs trying to get market share in the US. So this has really kind of driven competitive innovation as Roku has achieved market success. Android and Samsung and others have really tried to keep up, and a culture of innovation has basically emerged that is driving growth. I think the biggest, one of the biggest drivers is going to be essentially, as everyone's aware of, the FAST model, the free ad-supported streaming. So basically today, on a remote, I'll use LG as an example. You click the home button, you can get basically to a cable-like guide. You don't need to install an app. As you can see here, it plays extremely nicely with an antenna. So, and then you look down and a cable-like experience is literally channel up and down on the remote. Grandma can do it. You have to just plug the TV in, create an account, and it's being marketed as free cable. So what's the implications of this? Well, I think there's huge implications, and I'll tell you why. Number one, think about the global TV shipments that are happening. You can kind of look here at the trend, but basically, pre-COVID, we were on target to ship, call it 200 million smart TVs globally. That's 2.5x the total U.S. cable addressable footprint shipped out annually. Every single one of these sets is either easily convertible into a smart TV, but 95% of them in 20 should be smart TV innately enabled or baked into the firmware. So essentially, you're going to add 200 million consumers that are going to have basically free cable baked into this ecosystem. Combine that with backwards compatibility. The sets that have these high quality chipsets go back about 3 years. You're looking at a 600 to 800 million install base, depending on OS, how effective these guys are at making backwards compatible. But that's, in a few years, you're talking about 1 billion connected TV users globally, and growing at 20% a year. That's an amazing opportunity if you are in the ad-supported space, if you can build and operate linear channels, and you can do it on a global basis. What that tells me is the big trend is the space which has been really sort of the playground of independents, like my company and maybe a lot of you on this call. I would not hold your breath and wait for every major cable company, every major content provider that's sitting on dry powder of AVOD rights and content, whether it's library content that used to be on television that is redeployed under new brands and brought back to market, or whether it's content that's withheld specifically to compete with the original content. I think this market is going to mature. So if you kind of look at the cable universe, the basic cable universe, and you say, where are we in the predecessor era? We're like in the late 70s, early 80s, not a lot of original programming. We're starting to see some real adoption, but I think we're going to short circuit 15 years of basic cable deployment into, call it 36 months here. So I really think that this is going to be, one of the other factors that rapidly drives subscribers down. It's, to supplant basic cable and the fees, it doesn't need to be as good. It just needs to be good enough for free. and I think we're directionally almost there. Last point, and then I'll move on. We'll do some questions, and we'll get on to the next guys. Is the great rebundling is underway. We blew up the bundle, and now we're putting it back together. It's just going to look a little different than it did previously. I think the big thing that's going to be driving that is going to be mobile and telco bundling. As you look here, you know, standalone free and pay TV bundling globally has dropped pretty precipitously. Meanwhile, if you look at OTT bundling, it's basically replacing that. So, you know, everyone has seen, you know, the T-Mobile, Netflix on Us, Quibi bundled with T-Mobile, you know, or Verizon has a bundle, Disney Plus is bundled. I think, you know, as you start to look at where this goes, you know, 5G and other technologies that, you know, enable a really strong video experience. You know, bundling today is about a couple $2 billion a year business. With mobile, if you look at mobile bundling, I think that's going to be a huge driver of acquisition that will then in turn be consumed predominantly over time on smart TV. So, you know, some like Ovum here is predicting about a $5 billion market over the next couple of years. I think this underestimates it. If we start to think about cable bundling in here, probably triples this number over time. So I ran through a lot very quickly. Eric, I don't know if you want to pick out some questions, or if there's anything that you saw that maybe we should be addressing here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eric. We do have a question, and I want to turn it over or open it up for questions as well. For those of y'all who haven't asked a question on a Zoom call before, there's a Q&A button, I guess, down someplace on your screen, maybe at the bottom. And feel free to type it in there, and we'll see if we can get to it. We have one here. The first question is, how do you differentiate cable subscriptions for TV and cable subscriptions for the internet?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, if there's really kind of two buckets here, and they've all pretty much, you know, there's a lot of convergence, but cable subscriptions for the internet is ostensibly the virtual MVPD model. And I think, you know, that model was originally played to what consumers wanted, which was a big price differentiator. Obviously, as more and more channels have been added to those bundles to make them more competitive with cable, the price has gone up, which means ostensibly it's just a medium and delivery mechanism change. I think the real challenge there is it doesn't really address the business model that consumers want, which consumers basically have been saying, I want to pay for the channels I want, and I don't want to pay for the things I'm not watching. And if I can't get that model, I'm not going to pay for anything. And I will pay for then in turn the channels I want, which are now Netflix, Disney Plus, and so forth. So an alternative wasn't provided that satisfied those needs. So the consumers where price is a sticking point have moved. I think what we'll probably see over time is as the cost of content continues to rise and the margins continue to deplete, it doesn't make a whole lot of business sense for the cable companies to remain indefinitely providing a service that with the declining gross margins, which means you know, somebody who can handle it globally at scale, like Google with their YouTube TV product, which is quickly becoming the sort of premier virtual MVPD, will probably take the reins over time.
Awesome, thanks. You know what? We are right at time here. I'm going to close with one more question. Warren told us what you should do if you are in a leaky boat. My question is, what should you do if you're in a sinking ship? So, you know, in 1519, when the Spanish were landing, I believe it was near Veracruz, or I can't remember the exact port.
um, the term "burn the boats" was born, and that term derives from basically rather than having everyone flee the fight, they burned the boats so that they would have no choice but to enter the fray. And I think my suggestion to any company that is stalling, delaying, or using, has their head in the sand, and they're, look, I think most are doing things. I think the challenge is people are not moving fast enough. It's time to burn the boats. It's time to it's time to make the tough decisions and move forward and do the things that may, in the short term, cause you incredible pain, but you will ensure your survival if you are able to endure that pain.